I'm reading from The Mirage of Immortality. If we look at these universal states not as alien observers, but through the eyes of their own citizens, we shall find that these not only desire that these earthly commonwealths of theirs should live forever, but actually believe that the immortality of these human institutions is assured. And this sometimes in the teeth of contemporary events, which to an observer posted at a different standpoint in time or space, declare beyond question that this particular universal state is at that very moment in its last agonies. Why is it, such an observer might well ask, that in defiance of apparently plain facts, the citizens of a universal state are prone to regard it not as a night's shelter in the wilderness, but as the promised land, the goal of human endeavor? It should be said, however, that this sentiment is confined to the citizens of universal states established by indigenous empire builders. No Indian, for example, either desired or foretold the immortality of the British Raj. In the history of the Roman Empire, which was the universal state of the Hellenic civilization, we find the generation that had witnessed the establishment of the Pax Augusta asserting, in evidently sincere good faith, that the empire and the city had been built and endowed with a certain common immortality. Tibullus, from 54 to 18 BC, sings of the walls of the eternal city, while Virgil, 17 to 19 BC, makes his Phoepater, speaking of the future Roman scions of Aeneas race, say, "I give them empire without end." Livy writes with the same assurance of the city founded for eternity. Horace, skeptic though he was, in claiming immortality for his odes, takes as his concrete measure of eternity the repetition of an annual round of the religious ritual of the Roman city-state. The odes are still alive on the lips of men. How much longer their immortality will continue is uncertain, for the number of those who can quote them has been sadly diminished in recent times by changes in educational fashions. But at least they have lived 4 or 5 times as long as the Roman pagan ritual. More than 400 years after the age of Horace and Virgil, after the sack of Rome by Alaric, and already announced the end, we find the Gaelic poet Rutilius Nemantius still defiantly asserting Rome's immortality, and St. Jerome, in scholarly retreat at Jerusalem, interrupting his theological labors to express his grief and stupefaction in language almost identical to that of Rutilius. The pagan official and the Christian father are united in their emotional reactions to an event, as we now see it, had been inevitable for generations. The shock administered by the fall of Rome in AD 410 to the citizens of a transient universal state, which they had mistaken for an everlasting habitation, has its counterpart in the shock suffered by the subjects of the Arab Caliphate when Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258 AD. In the Roman world, the shock was felt from Palestine to Gaul. In the Arab world, from Fargana to Ataluska. The intensity of the psychological effect is even more remarkable in this than in the Roman case. For by the time when Hulagu gave the Abbasid Caliphate its coup de grace. Its sovereignty had been ineffective for 3 or 4 centuries over the greater part of the vast domain nominally subject to it. This halo of an illusionary immortality worn by moribund universal states often persuades the more prudent barbarian leaders in the very act of parceling out their dominions among themselves to acknowledge an equally illusory subjection. The Amulung leaders of the Aryan Ostrogoths and the Buwahid leaders of the Shi-Delamis sought title for their conquest by ruling them, in official theory, as vicegerents of the emperor at Constantinople and the caliph at Baghdad, respectively. And though this tactful handling of a senile universal state did not avail, in their case, to avert the doom to which both of these war bands condemned themselves by clinging to their distinctive religious heresies, the same political maneuvers was brilliantly successful when executed by fellow barbarians who had the sagacity or good fortune to be at the same time impeccable in their professions of religious faith. Clovis the Frank, for example, the most successful of all the founders of barbarian successor states of the Roman Empire, followed up his conversion to Catholicism by obtaining from the Emperor Anastasius in distant Constantinople the title of proconsul with the constant insignia. His success is attested by the fact that in later ages, no less than 18 royal Louis reigning in the land that he conquered bore a modified variant of his name. The Ottoman Empire, which became, as we have seen in an earlier part of this study, the universal state of a Byzantine civilization, exhibited the same characteristics of illusionary immortality at a time when it had already become the sick man of Europe. The ambitious warlords who were carrying out for themselves successor states, Mehmed off in Egypt and Syria, and Ali of Yania in Albania and Greece, and Epasvagolu of Eden in the northwestern corner of Rumelia, were sedulous in doing in the Padishah's name all that they were doing to his detriment in their own private interest. When the Western powers followed in their footsteps, they adopted the same fictions. Great Britain, for example, administers Cyprus from 1878 and Egypt from 1882 in the name of the Sultan at Constantinople until she found herself at war with Turkey in 1914. The Mughal universal state of the Hindu civilization displays the same features. Within half a century of Emperor Aswanjib's death in 1707, an empire which had once exercised effective sovereignty over the greater part of the Indian subcontinent had been whittled down to a torso some 250 miles long and 100 miles broad. After another half-century, it had been reduced to the circuit of the walls of the Red Fort at Delhi. Yet 150 years on their throne, and might have been left there much longer if the mutineers of 1857 had not forced this poor puppet against his wishes to give his blessing to their revolt against a Raj from overseas, which had, after a period of anarchy, replaced the long-extinct Mughal Raj, which he still symbolized. A still more remarkable testimony to the tenacity of the belief in the immortality of universal states is the practice of evoking their ghosts after they have proven themselves mortal by expiring. The Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad was thus resuscitated in the name of the shape of the Holy Roman Empire of the West and the East Roman Empire of Orthodox Christendom, and the Empire of the Seas in Han's dynasties in the shape of the Sui and Tang Empire of the Far Eastern civilization. The surname of the founder of the Roman Empire was revived in the titles Kaiser and Tsar, and the title of Caliph, which originally meant successor of Muhammad after haunting Cairo, passed on to Istanbul, where it survived until its abolition at the hands of westernizing revolutionists in the 20th century. These are only a selection from the wealth of historical examples illustrating a fact that the belief in the immortality of the universal states survives for centuries after it has been confuted by plain, hard facts. What are the causes of this strange phenomenon? One manifest cause is the potency of the impression made by the founders and the great rulers of universal states. An impression handed on to a receptive posterity with an emphasis which exaggerates an imposing truth into an overwhelming legend. Another cause is the impressiveness of the institution itself, apart from the genius displayed by its greatest rulers. A universal state captivates hearts and minds because it is the embodiment of a rally from the long unhalted route of a time of troubles. And it was this aspect of the Roman Empire that eventually won the admiration of originally hostile Greek men of letters, writing in the age of the Antoines, which Gibbon long afterwards was to adjudge the period when the human race attained its highest point of felicity. There is no salvation in the exercise of a dominion divorced from power. To find oneself under the dominion of one's superiors is a second best alternative. But this second best proved to be the best of all in our present experience of the Roman Empire. This happy experience has moved the whole world to cleave to Rome with might and main. The world would no more think of ceding from Rome than a ship's crew would think of parting company with the pilot. You must have seen the bats in a cave clinging tight to another in the rocks, and this is an apt image of the whole world's dependence on Rome. In every heart today, the focus of anxiety is the fear of becoming detached from the cluster. The thought of being abandoned by Rome is so appalling that it precludes any thought of wantonly abandoning her. There is an end of those disputes over sovereignty and prestige which were the causes of the outbreak of all the wars of the past. And while some nations, like noisily flowing water, are delightfully quiet, rejoicing in their release from the toil and trouble, and aware at last that all their old struggles were to no purpose, there are other nations which do not even know or remember whether they once sat in the seat of power. In fact, we are witnessing a new version of Pamphylian's myth, or is it Plato's own? After a moment when the states of the world were already laid out on the funeral pyre as victims of their own fratricidal strife and turmoil, they were all at once presented with the Roman dominion and straightway to life again. How they arrived at this condition they are unable to say. They know nothing about it and can only marvel at their present well-being. They, like sleepers awakened, to have come to themselves and now dismiss from their thoughts the dreams that obsessed them only a moment ago. They no longer find it credible that there were ever such things as wars. The entire inhibited world now keeps perpetual holiday. so that the only people who still need pity for the good things that they are missing are those outside your empire, if there are any such people left. This quaint skepticism on the question whether there were in fact any people worth mentioning outside the Roman Empire is characteristic and is our justification for calling such institutions universal states. They were universal, not geographically, but psychologically. Horace, for example, in one of his odes, tells us that he does not bother about the threats of the Tiridates. The king of Parthia no doubt existed, but he simply did not matter. In a similar vein, the Manchu emperors of the far eastern universal state assumed in their diplomatic dealings that all governments, including those of the Western world, had at some unspecified period in the past received permission to exist from the Chinese authorities. And yet the reality of these universal states was something very different from the brilliant surface that they presented to Aurelius, Aristides, and their other panegyrists in various ages and various climes. An obscure divinity of the Nubian marches of the Egyptiatic universal state was transfigured by the genius of Hellenic mythology into a mortal king of Ethiopians who had the misfortune to be loved by Eos, the immortal goddess of the dawn. The goddess besought her fellow Olympians to confer on her human lover the immortality which she and her peers enjoyed, and jealous though they were of their divine privileges, she teased them into yielding at last to her feminine importunity. Yet even this grudging gift was marred by a fatal flaw, for the eager goddess had forgotten that the Olympian's immortality was mated with an everlasting youth, and the other immortals had spitefully taken care to grant her no more than her bare request. The consequence of both ironic and tragic. After a honeymoon that flashed past in the twinkling of an Olympian eye, Eos and her now immortal, but still inexorably aging mate, found themselves condemned for eternity to grieve together over Tithonius's hapless plight, a senility to which the merciful hand of death could never set a term, was an affliction that no mortal man could ever be made to suffer, and an eternal grief was an obsession that left no room for any other thought or feeling. For any human soul or human institution, an immortality in this world would prove a martyrdom, even if it were unaccompanied by either physical decrepitude or mental senility. In this sense, wrote the philosophic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who lived from 1681 or from 161 to 80 BC or AD. It would be true to say that any man of 40 who is endowed with moderate intelligence has seen in the light of the uniformity of nature the entire past and future. If this is the estimate of the capacity of human souls for experience, strikes the reader as an inordinately low one, he may find the reason in the age in which Marcus lived, for an Indian summer is an age of boredom. The price of the Roman peace was the forfeiture of Hellenic liberty. And though the liberty might always have been the privilege of a minority, this privileged minority might have turned irresponsible and oppressive. It was manifest in retrospect that the turbulent wickedness of the Caesarean climax of a Hellenic time of troubles had provided a wealth of exciting and inspiring themes for Roman public speakers, which their epigeny in a smugly ordered Trajanic epoch might conventionally condemn as horrors, not nostri seculi, but most secretly envy, as they found themselves perpetually failing in their laborious efforts to substitute far-fetched artifice for the stimulus of importunate life. On the morrow of the breakdown of the Hellenic society, Plato, anxiously seeking to safeguard it against a further fall by pegging it into a securely rigid posture, had idealized the comparative stability of the Egyptiatic culture. And 1,000 years later, when this Egyptiatic culture was still being, while Hellenic civilization had arrived at its last agonies, the last of the Neoplatonists pushed their reputed master sediment to an almost frenzied pitch of uncritical admiration. Thanks to the obstinacy of the Egyptiac universal state in again and again insisting on returning to life after its body had been duly laid on the salutary funeral pyre, the Egyptiatic civilization lived to see its contemporaries, the Minoan, the Sumeric, the Indus culture, all pass away and give place to successors of a younger generation, some of which had passed away in their turn, while the Egyptiatic society was still kept alive. Egyptiatic students of history have observed the birth and death of the first Syriac, Hittite, and Babylonic offspring of the Sumerian civilization, and the rise and decline of the Syriac and Hellenic offspring of the Minoan. Yet the fabulously long drawn-out epilogue to the broken down Egyptiatic society's natural term of life was but an alteration of long stretches of boredom with hectic bouts of demonic energy into which this somnolent society was galvanized by the impact of alien bodies social. The same rhythm of trance-like somnolence alternating with outbursts of fanatical exophobia can be discerned in the epilogue to the history of the Far Eastern civilization in China. The tincture of Far Eastern Christian culture in the Mongols, who had forced upon China an alien universal state, evoked a reaction in which the Mongols were evicted and their dominion was replaced by the indigenous universal state of the Ming. Even the Manchu barbarians who stepped into the political vacuum created by the Ming's collapse and whose taint of the Far Eastern Christian culture was less noticeable than their receptivity in adopting the Chinese way of life, aroused a popular opposition which in southern China, at any rate, never ceased to maintain itself underground and broke into the open again in this Taiping insurrection of AD in 1852 to 64. The infiltration of the early modern Western civilization in its Catholic Christian form in the 16th and 17th centuries provoked the proscription of Catholicism in the first quarter of the 18th century. The blasting open of the sea gates of China for Western trade between 1839 and 1861 AD provoked the retort of the anti-Western Boxer rising of AD 1900, and the Manchu dynasty was overthrown in AD 1911 in retribution for the double crime of being ineradicably alien itself and at the same time showing itself incompetent to keep the now far more formidable alien force of Western penetration at bay. Happily, life is kinder than legend, and the sentence of immortality which mythology passed on to Thermomenes is commuted for the benefit of the universal states of history to not indeterminate longevity. Marcus's disillusioned man of 40 must die at last, though he may outlive his zest for life by 50 or 60 years, and a universal state that kicks again and again against the pricks of death until wither away in the course of ages, like the pillar of salt that was fabled to be petrified substance of a once living woman. That's a lot. So what does that say? It basically says that we are Rome. And just like the Romans, we see immortality in ourselves, and we're unable to see past it. And that's where I am. I know that was deep and a lot, but it's really the basis of all history, is one group after another thinking they're immortal and believing it. And that was the beginning of the end for that group. And I'm afraid that we might be right there with them, failing to anticipate what we need to do to move forward.